Good evening, everyone. Hi, my name is Olave Duanje. It is my sincere pleasure and honor to welcome you tonight to the second installment of the More Than Human Encounters series. The More Than Human Encounters series seeks to situate human to more than human relationships, to formulate conditions of liberation, and to envision perhaps coexistence in a world that has been modeled by the ever present context of imperialism, patriarchy, and capitalism. Now, this series is the product of a partnership between Crosstalks VUB and Kai Theater. So earlier I said that it was my pleasure to welcome you, but I want to explain that a little bit. Not so long ago, Goedele Newtons asked me from Crosstalk, invited me to co-curate this second installment. And I'm very proud that what we've managed to do with the second installment is to invite legal scholars, activists, artists, liberation philosophers that will help us to identify the possibilities and the limitations that are enshrined in our conceptions of the human, of the animal, of nature, whether it is in law, in philosophy, in ethics, in economics, or politics. Now, to keep up with Goedele and our joint ambitions for this second more than human encounter, we had to deep dive into the fast growing world of animal studies. And one of the first and most persuasive thinkers on the present state and the future of animal rights that Goedele introduced me to was Manisha Deka. Manisha is a professor and Lansdowne Chair in Law at the University of Victoria. She's joining us from Canada. She's a true Renaissance thinker with her research covering not only animal law and critical animal studies, but also feminist theory, reproductive policy, bioethics, health law, and vulnerability studies. And as we will see tonight, she is as learned as she is inventive. In her lecture tonight, she shares with us her brand new theory that introduces a novel legal category, that of beingness. Believe you me, this is very promising and exciting stuff. After the lecture, we have asked our very own Brussels based Mariska Jung to interview, to converse, and perhaps even co-invent with Professor Manisha. Mariska Jung is a PhD candidate at the Vrije Universiteit Belgium. Brussels, sorry. Belgium.
In Belgium.
In Belgium, yes. She's based at the Department for Political Sciences and is active within RIA, which is the university's research center on gender, diversity, and intersectionality. But it doesn't stop there because you also are a member of the Race and Religion Constellation Research Hub at Radboud Universiteit Nijmegen in the Netherlands.
That's true.
Where do you find the time exactly?
Well, I think academics are notoriously overworked anyway.
Oh, okay.
So I joined the ranks of neoliberal academic staff.
Well, Jung studies contemporary racism in Europe and theorizes on the dynamics between race, religion, and animality. As such, her work is situated at the crossroads of political theory, critical animal studies, critical race theory, religious studies, and gender and queer scholarship. In other words, no one better to engage, challenge, and perhaps translate Professor Manisha to us, for us, and with us. I just want to point out to everyone in the Zoom, you can ask questions, right? So there's a Q&A in the Zoom area. I don't know exactly how it works, but I know you can ask questions and we want you to make use of that. This will be the point where normally I would ask the audience to, with a great warm applause, to welcome Professor Manisha to the stage. But given the limitations of our times, I can only, and that on behalf of Marlene Wijnands and Goedele Newtons, I can only offer Professor Manisha my warmest gratitude for joining us tonight and invite you to get started.
Thank you so much, Ola and Hudala and Mariska and all the organizers for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you all for joining me today. I'd like to start off by acknowledging that myself and my university, the University of Victoria, is situated on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen peoples, and that the relationships that the Esquimalt, Songhees, and Wasanich First Nations have to the land continue to this day. As you may know, Canada, or what is known as Canada today, is going through a national reckoning of our settler colonial past. And the book project that I have the fortune of speaking about with you this evening, I see as very much part of this project in this conversation. I will share my screen in a moment, but let me also apologize. I've just come down in the last few days with a bit of a cough, so invariably there will be some coughing, and I thank you in advance for bearing with me. So let me just go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you're all seeing the first title slide. So yes, the title of my book is just the title of this talk, Animals as Legal Beings, Contesting Anthropocentric Legal Orders. And it is published this month from University of Toronto Press. And so I'd like to give you a snapshot of the argument I'm offering here in terms of suggesting a new legal classification for animals. So first, let me just go over the purposes I had in writing the book, as well as a few of the departure points. The introduction has many more in written form, but I'll just name and highlight a few. And then the book is divided into two parts. Part one is called Beyond Property and Personhood. And part two is called Animals as Legal Beings, and legal beingness being the new category that I'm working toward in terms of the part one explanation and build up to then part two explicating what I mean by this category. And then I'd also like to spend some time going over the conclusion, because that's where I lay out some of the preliminary kind of concrete material steps that I see that could occur right now without waiting, for that lovely day in the future when this might actually take effect and animals are no longer property, as to how legal systems can change. Okay, so I had two main purposes in writing the book. The first, excuse me, was to theorize a new transformative legal subjectivity for animals in Canadian law. So as in many jurisdictions, all the jurisdictions around the world, in terms of formal codified legal systems, you have animals as property, legally classified as property. And so this, of course, is an instrumentalized take on what animals are and what they're worth. And so not a transformative subjectivity. And the kind of reply to that in most animal law scholarship has been, at least in the common law worlds, right, which most of Canada is a part of, is to offer personhood as the antidote to the problematic property status. And the argument I make in the book is actually personhood is itself not very animal friendly, and we need a different status that truly is better at being friendlier to who animals are and what they have to offer in and of themselves. So that was the first purpose, to take animals out of the property category and put them into a category that would work best for them. And then the second purpose was to make an intervention into animal law and animal law scholarship itself. As you may have observed from your own examinations in this area, Most animal legal scholarship in English, and so what we see predominating in the United States and Canada, and even in other countries that are very much influenced by the scholarship, is a liberal outlook on how to think about animals. One that offers various theories like utilitarianism, deontology, and iterations or subsets thereof, but still very much wonders about how animals can be shown or proven to be human-like. And so you still have kind of a human benchmark embedded in the liberal theorizing, and the arguments are about how animals measure up to this human benchmark as to who counts and why, either in ethics or in law. And I draw from my own academic background, as Ola mentioned, in feminist theory, in post-colonial theory, and so that those theoretical frameworks are very central to the argument and discussion in the book, but also from critical disability studies, from post-structuralist theory, and just kind of theories of difference in general, to suggest what's wrong with a liberal formulation for animals in terms of a personhood status to then argue toward beingness. Okay, and so just some quick departure points. First, I want to acknowledge that, even the most well-intentioned kind of intervention by humans for animals is invariably going to be anthropocentric and colonizing for animals, right? Because you're having humans try to figure out what they need and what might be good for them. This is a problem that is not going to go away. I still do think it's worth engaging with law, legal institutions, other human-made institutions for the benefit of animals, because the alternative to do nothing seems to be just too hopeless and dismal if you consider the conditions that so many animals are in. Departure point number 2, the argument in the book is really kind of impugning anthropocentric legal orders. So in the Canadian context, it's really taking aim at the colonial common law. And so I take that as kind of my main case study, but the argument can be extrapolated to civil law jurisdictions and any really anthropocentric legal jurisdiction. And the departure point number 3 is that I want to acknowledge that I'm using the term animal, but of course there's so much writing on what is problematic with that term itself in terms of already kind of setting up a human exceptionalist frame. In the book, I talk about this a bit more, but at the end of the day, I don't have another term to offer. So as a shorthand and point of convenience, I keep using the word animal to talk about all the other animals that aren't human. Okay. All right, so part 1, beyond property and personhood. Okay, so part 1 has 3 chapters. The first is where I make the argument that the current property status for animals in Canadian law and in other jurisdictions is not animal friendly. I think hopefully that's obvious to most of us. In my time, I won't set out that argument in detail, but really property sets up a capitalist system that lets animals be used as commodities. And we know the fatal ends that usually leads to, and the immiserated conditions of living that also leads to. All right, so chapter 2 then. Well, if not property, when we think personhood is the viable legal status for animals that we should all advocate for. Especially in a common law system where you have a very binary structure. We're either all legally classified as property or persons. And this is the argument that many animal law scholars make. So this book is actually, perhaps its innovation comes in suggesting that personhood is actually not an animal-friendly category. So I just like to spend some time, teasing out this argument. And then chapter 3, before I introduce my kind of newly theorized category of beingness, I just set out some other, long-standing assumptions in anthropocentric legal orders that would have to change as well before getting to beingness. Okay, so let me just go to chapter 2 and the argument about what's wrong with personhood, because this might not be apparent. What is wrong with personhood? Well, if you look And if you look at the jurisprudence around personhood, how it's talked about, when it is talked about, it's actually, one of these legal categories that are just so foundational, but like rarely discussed by jurists. But if you look at its history, its genealogy, you'll see that it's very much premised on this idea of the rational person. So this idea of a human being who is, completely rational, is motivated by reason, who is kind of bodiless, doesn't have a body, and no other identifying factors that matter, except kind of being of the mind and organizing their affairs completely thereof. And there's actually, a disavowal of actual bodies by the law in terms of valuing the person. So many critical theorists, not even thinking about animals, but just thinking about marginalized human groups, have written about the problem in this idea of like who the person is in the legal understanding of personhood. Anna Greer has written about this specifically, but so many others as well. And others have even taken this further to say that when we are conferring personhood, it actually really perpetuates colonial civilizational narratives about ideas of a paradigmatic human. So if you think of just, post-colonial, anti-colonial critiques of civilizing missions and the ideas of ranking civilizations according to certain metrics, that personhood actually perpetuates that type of narrative because it's so embedded into it. But what about the argument, okay, well, why can't we just get rid of all that old baggage and rehabilitate this concept? And then I draw on theory that actually shows that law's understanding of who is a person and who is property actually pivots on the binary between the human and the animal, such that it's not just a matter of moving animals from the property realm to the personhood realm and elevating them. Actually, the personhood property distinction doesn't make sense without, pivoting or hinging on a human animal distinction. So it's almost like these concepts don't make sense when you take away the human animal distinction. So I make these several arguments to contest the kind of desirability of personhood as the new category for animals. And I say, at the end of the day, personhood is already such a far off legal outcome for animals, right? That's still somewhat of a utopian idea. We're getting a little closer with the events happening, so I don't want to be completely hopeless about that coming to fruition at some point. But if we're in, the kind of situation of thinking of a new legal category for animals, why settle on something that's already there that was really molded out of a certain history and privileges a certain type of human body? And why don't we just think of something that could be, kind of built up from the ground up and respect animals much better? Okay, and so before getting to beingness, I just want to set out what chapter 3 is about. Here I talk about, of course, just changing animals' legal category from property to something else is not going to, be the only transformation that we'll need to see in the legal systems to make them more animal friendly. The common law has quite a long-standing kind of hostile relationship to the idea of valuing emotions and then seeing reason and exalting reason as being, completely separate from valuing emotions or even seeing emotions and reasoning or reasoning as an emotions-based process. So this sharp binary has to change is what I'm saying. Also, the whole human exceptionalism in the law would also have to be abate, if not disappear. We also know that the common law system tends to be very rights-based. And so rights typically shift our attention to, what am I entitled to, right? Please don't do this to me, right? The state should not interfere. So all of that has its place and can be good. But when we're very rights-focused, we forget about duties and responsibilities and accountability. So I talk in chapter 3 about the need to bring more of an idea of response, a collective responsibility into the law. And then another kind of animal-friendly move that I argue for in chapter 3 is that is for legal decision makers, judges, politicians, legislators, municipal councilors, policymakers even, to have a real attention back to the body and back to the flesh of the body in terms of, you know, the woundability of our flesh, and the relationality that we are placed in because of it. All right, so those are some, it's a more philosophical chapter and then sets up the second part of the book, animals as beings. Okay, so here there are two main chapters. Chapter 4 is I set out what I mean by beingness, which I'll discuss in a moment. And chapter 5 is called Liberal Humanism Repackaged. I could also have named that chapter, What About Plants? Which is the most common question that I think myself and all other animal theorists get when we argue about why we need to think about animals. Invariably, the question comes up, what about plants? Okay, so that chapter 5 is also looking at that. So I'll speak about that in a moment too. Okay, so if I had to take the whole book and, pare it down to one slide and one chart, this would be it. On the left side, we have personhood. Excuse me. And the markers of personhood, again, when you look at cases and discussions about personhood where it is discussed, is this idea, when we say we're legal persons, what does that mean? How does the law see us? Well, really, when you strip it all away, the law sees you as a hyper-rational, independent individual who's completely disembodied. And myself and other critical theorists in the, working within feminist theory, disability studies, anti-race theory, have talked about what's problematic with that idea of the person. How would beingness be different? So in the second column, I've juxtaposed the main features that beingness as a legal status would, implement to talk about who animals are. Instead of being disembodied, rational, independent individuals, which is the personhood model, the beingness lets us see a being in an embodied, vulnerable relational frame. So in this chapter, I take, again, a lot of the critical theory that talks about the importance of seeing embodiment, of thinking about the body, that talks about the need to imagine humans as vulnerable, that talks about the need to imagine humans and our communities as relational, as a way to get away from kind of the liberal idea of the person. And I ask, is there anything in these theories that have, long made the case for having an alternative visioning of why humans matter, i.e. because we're embodied, because we're vulnerable, because we're relational? Is there anything in these theories that prevent them from applying to animals, from going beyond the human realm? And I argue that there isn't. So animals can be seen in an embodied way, right? As vulnerable beings, as existing in relationships. And then the job then of a legal system that imagines animals as beings is to attend to their needs as embodied, vulnerable, and relational beings. Rather than how are they now seen? As property. So they're seen as nothing in the law. When you're property, you're not a subject. You're just the object to which rights attach, to which legal persons' rights attach, whether they're humans or corporations or ships, all the beings, all the entities that law currently allows to be persons, not animals. But of course, the argument here is that personhood is not that friendly to animals. Let's start with something new. And this is what I mean by legal beingness. And then in chapter 5, it's the What About Plants chapter, but I actually think about other beings and this critical scholarship about them. So not just plants, but bodies of water, robots, artificial intelligence. And I take on, what I think is a really serious objection to the argument I'm making and try to answer it, which is, okay, I'm contesting a certain type of line drawing, right? A line drawing that draws a line between humans and all other animals. And I want to move the line down to include, in terms of the hierarchy, to include all animals. But am I also not just drawing another line, right? What about all the non-humans that are placed even as lesser life forms in our traditional kind of Western hierarchy of ranking life? And so that's what chapter 5 is about. And at the end of the day, I defend myself saying I'm not just kind of repackaging liberal humanism. But I do say that because part of the debate here is about when is it appropriate to look at capacities. So liberal views on animal ethics have really said, it's discriminatory to oust animals from legal consideration because they can't do what humans do, because in fact they can do what humans do. So of course, then we're just valuing a certain capacity. We have a pre-existing idea of what matters, what feature or capacity of someone matters. And if that person has that capacity, they get legal protection or they get moral consideration. If they don't, then they're instrumentalized. All right. I say, that is a faulty way of thinking. But does that mean that capacities can never matter in our moral or legal judgments? And I take on this question and probe more deeply and say, no, capacities can matter, but it doesn't have to result in a ranking of different beings. So the book addresses animals. I say beingness could be a category for plants, but I don't spend the space and time in the book making that argument. But I hope I've been clear in this chapter, and I'm sure my readers will let me know if I haven't, as to why I don't see myself as just redrawing another line. And then finally in chapter 6, this is where I kind of forced myself in response to a reviewer comment to set out some concrete steps. How could the law move forward right now in terms of beingness, even if beingness was, really a long way off? Let's imagine that there's a legal system that is going to implement this. What would be some first steps? Okay, so the chapter starts off with just, reminding ourselves as to why beingness makes a difference in personhood. And I take an example recently in Canada, where you had a barn fire and 43 horses died. And this was national front page news, and there were obituaries for the horses. And from one perspective, this is remarkable. The fact that, there's a national grieving of animal life is quite revolutionary in itself. But from another perspective, and as letter writers from different animal organizations, farmed animal organizations wrote in, there are like hundreds of thousands of chickens who have died also in fires, factory farm fires. Where is the grief for them? And I take that as a way to illustrate the difference that beingness can make, i.e. that it can, showcase the farmed animals, those animals that are never going to be seen to be human-like, like the whales are, or like the primates are, or like the elephants are. So as having a better chance under beingness to morally matter, to legally matter, than under personhood. And then I come to the section about, okay, what would be some first steps? So here I've just outlined 3 main steps. Well, first, there would have to be, criminal prohibitions about most animal use industries, because they are reliant on a property status of animals. That's what permits these industries to be legal. So of course, farming, also research, entertainment, textiles, it would be wholesale reorganization of life. But we know from our last year that things that we thought were impossible in terms of reorganization can become very possible if there's the political will, right? And then I also set out the new legislative principles, which would basically be to, so in law, you can set out in statutes interpretive principles that guide the people doing the interpretation. So kind of the civil servants working with the legislation on the ground and administrative structures, or eventually if it's contested and goes into a lawsuit, the judges who have to interpret the law and say what's the right meaning. The legislators, the politicians who pass the law in the first place can put into that statute, this is how we mean this section to be interpreted. This is what this word should mean. And so I argue for certain legislative interpretive principles in statutes that are animal friendly, like working against human exceptionalist thinking. In step 2, I talk about designing models for animal friendly decision making, because someone might throw up their hands and say, well, animals can't talk. How do we know what they want? And that's the end of that. Well, actually, there are human beings who don't verbalize. And actually, a lot of human to human communication for all of us is mostly nonverbal, right? So there are ways to figure out and to approximate someone else's decision making, even when we can't be in their interior space to know exactly what they want. So that's what I bring out in step 2, that we can get to these models that are already in use, substitute decision making, supported decision making for certain human groups, and also extended to animals. And then step 3, it's possible also to listen to animals, to partner with them to discern their needs. And I talk about some of the scholarship there that says actually animals can be not just co-decision makers, but they can be partners in kind of creating their lives. So trying to give back the agency that we might think is just invested in the human. And for those who may be interested in an actual case study, I do provide one. How can we care? Let's say if today beingness is implemented in a jurisdiction. So animals today started off as property and going through the factory farming processing as property, but their legal status has changed. So they're not killed and they stay on as beings. How to care for them? I talk about what that would mean in terms of the prohibitions, shifts to sanctuaries, how sanctuaries can be run. And I focus on farm animals, land animals, because they are a very, very large group, just shy of the aquaculture, the fish and other sea creatures who are farmed. And then finally, I end the book with saying, I realize that a lot of what I'm saying is not going to come to fruition tomorrow, next month, next year, or perhaps for quite some time. What can we do in the meantime is what many groups are doing worldwide, is to bear witness. And I close the book with, I think, a particular poignant quote from Katie Gillespie, an American scholar, and her fieldwork in the Pacific Northwest of the United States on dairy cows, as to what a different life for an animal at a sanctuary can look like under a beingness model. This cow that was named Sadie, rather than under the property model. So thank you so much. I look forward to your questions and to any comments. And I will stop sharing the screen at this point.
Thank you so much, Manisha, for your wonderful talk. For you and for everyone at home, I'm extremely uncomfortable in this chair. So if you see me moving around a lot, that is because of that. But yeah, I really was super excited to be able to talk to you and to be able to ask you some questions. First of all, I'd really like to thank Olave and Goedele from Crosstalks as well to have me here. Because your work has been so formative to my own thinking in this respect, and especially your earlier articles on the ways in which you relate gender to species, and also in another chapter on how you okay, another thing that's distracting to me, just for everyone at home, I just tend to vocalize it, is that I see myself as well on this screen. But I'm just saying it out loud. It's a bit distracting. But anyways, so also your chapter that you wrote about how a systemic anti-racism, as you called it, is an important condition for animal politics to be just. So you really tie this sort of intersectionality into your thinking around animals and to struggle against injustice towards animals. And so, yeah, I'm super excited to talk to you about that. Thank you so much. One of my first questions is maybe to start off a bit more introductory about you. I've read the book Messy Eating. For the people at home who are interested, it's a book about conversations on animals as food. And it's an interview with many leading scholars in the field, such as you, to talk a bit more personally about their own political, personal, and intellectual trajectory as to how do you come, have you come interested in animal care, and also particularly maybe for you, how do you have sort of tied it into injustices such as sexism and racism? So I was wondering if you could maybe take us through a bit towards your own development in this respect.
Yes, sure, certainly. So it really started for me in university and as an undergraduate in the early 90s and at McGill University, Montreal. And where I was, taking a lot of liberal arts courses and being exposed to theories of deconstruction and a lot of contestation of difference and naturalized boundaries exposed as or argued to be social constructions. And so then I always wondered, what about the human animal boundary? And why isn't anyone really talking about this? And at the same time, I'd also read Alice Walker's work, really loved her and continue to love her as an author, but read a lot of her novels at that point. And also heard some of her kind of interview material about animals, and then read her short story, Am I Blue? Where she talks about the plight of a horse. And so it was just, and then I was involved in student activism as well, very much through kind of feminist anti-racist politics. And then I had, peers who were also asking these questions. And also from my own background, growing up as a South Asian Canadian, we didn't grow up vegetarian, but it was never, non-vegetarian food was never that prominent. And I had exposure being in India and seeing just, in restaurants like non-veg versus veg. And then you get a different framing as to what is normative in terms of the class. And I also taken religious based courses to learn more about my own background, Hinduism, Buddhism, and then seeing the vegetarian texts, reading about Gandhi. All of that came to kind of, in my little undergraduate kind of exposure. And I started writing papers about animals in my classes where I could, because there wasn't, any animal studies course, and getting sometimes not, but sometimes encouraging feedback about the topic. And then I really just read more and more. But it was really also, I want to credit my brother, who was a bit ahead of me in university years, who came back with more activist literature, which, we just never think about where our food comes from. And that had an immediate effect on me. And it relates to the messy eating chapter, kind of hearing about mother cows and calves and what happens to animals in separation, families and transport. So that's how I personally kind of overnight became vegetarian. And then as I learned more about veganism, transitioned to that as well. So I would say it was family influence as well as the external academic high theory influence, and then my own ability to pursue that as a junior scholar student that helped me continue on that path.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. So I really also see there how you also sort of have become committed as an academic to really put your work to use towards social change, because this is also something that you emphasize in the book, because I've had the great pleasure to be able to read 2 draft chapters of the book that you were so kind to send in advance, where you also really state like you align your work with critical animal studies, as this field is really taking up the political task of changing the material lives for animals for the better. And I really see here how you sort of have already experienced that during your graduate and undergraduate studies, and you now do that as a full-fledged academic.
Yes, because I think along with some other scholars, I have some frustrations, although I can understand, academics who are writing and the value of scholarship on its own, definitely. I don't want to contest that. But I also feel there should be a practical impact for the work I'm doing, and some type of political kind of goal in terms of recommendations that are done in the scholarship or what have you. So I see that as coming out of certain subsets of animal studies versus others. So to that extent, yes, my work is more situated with kind of that inclination or orientation.
Yeah. So just for the people watching at home, I feel such a TV host to be able to say that. I'm more used to doing this in sort of live audience setting. So this is really, again, interesting. But so for people at home, Olave is checking the chat. So if you do have, not the chat, the Q&A.
The Q&A.
So if you have questions in the meantime, please do write them. I'm asking.
They're coming.
They're coming?
There
are a
are
lot of them coming.
questions.
So maybe we should first give the audience the time to ask some questions before I add one of my more content.
Do you want one of the?
I think so.
Okay,
yeah.
let me see. Look. Let's start with an easy one. Okay. When you mention that personhood is not that friendly to animals, and you describe personhood as independent, individual, rational, and disembodied, I just wondered how friendly actually is to humans. Would it make sense to suggest beingness as a legal concept for humans as well? We got this question from Karin Hannes. I thought that was a
that's a wonderful question.
that's a wonderful question.
Yes, it is. So I do think so. And I just make a quick side note of that in the book that sure, beingness could be more human friendly for so many humans. But the focus of the book, of course, is to make the argument for animals. But definitely, again, critical scholarship of personhood by legal scholars or socio-legal scholars that are not really addressing animals have made this argument that personhood is really molded in kind of this paradigmatic frame, which tracks class privilege, gender privilege, ability privilege, age privilege, and it doesn't work very easily. And actually, in the histories of the centuries where personhood was formally extended, so the law formally, right, extended equality to previously excluded groups who were seen as property, chattel, or just weren't, their personhood wasn't recognized in marriage or what have you, that it actually doesn't work very well. And their ongoing kind of entangled disputes in different cases over certain types of rights that show like personhood is a clunky, clumsy, or cumbersome, not nimble concept for even these groups. So, but I mean, we have to recognize that it's had a long-standing history and it's not going anywhere soon. But so in the case of animals, where they don't even have it yet, so they're still formally in the situation of formal inequality, right? Because they're seen as property. This is why I say, I mean, this is really a ripe moment for theorizing something new for them. Because, one of the concerns about getting traction among mainstream thinkers, people who are used to anthropocentric thinking and who then, in their decision-making capacity as judges or policymakers, legislators, encounter, let's say, animal rights arguments about why animals should matter, is right the kind of knee-jerk reaction that, well, you can't say they're equivalent to humans. Like humans are persons. So that's actually one I think advantage of a different term for animals, beingness, because you don't have to say they're equivalent to humans. The whole point of beingness is to respect animal difference rather than saying they're equivalent to humans. And kind of, in the world of like 60, not even 5-second sound bites and 140 characters, to say, well, we're arguing that animals are beings, and you don't even have to reference personhood. I think that's actually like a discursive kind of strategy that might be more useful. I do want to recognize that there are personhood projects right now in various jurisdictions for animals that I would support if asked to put my name on it, right? And petitions or what have you, writing letters. But that at the end of the day, I really do think it will be another category that is able to see the full panoply of animals and not just the humanized animals like the whales, primates, and the elephants.
Can I just complicate this particular question?
Completely. I want to build up on this as well. So let's ping up.
Maybe it's one that's because here there's somebody asking whether beingness, whether you could elaborate briefly on the implications of beingness for artificial systems. And it's, according to Sven, it seems to me that beings is a category that can be beneficial even in our consideration of more complex artificial systems, although it does seem to conflict with your flesh condition. And also somebody asked about how about insects, but okay.
Okay,
I think
we'll come to that. We'll come to that.
Yes, thank you for that question. So artificial systems, I'm understanding, is artificial intelligence, like robots, right? So so just like plants, like beingness could be available for robots as well. And so yes, thank you for remembering that. One of the other orientations I was looking for was attention to flesh, but I don't see that as excluding other kind of non-flesh based non-humans from consideration. It would just I think that, I mean, that's something I have to think about more, but I don't mean it to be exclusive for other flesh-based, non-flesh-based non-humans, let's say like artificial intelligence entities. The other question was insects. So I do include insects in my definition of animals as they are included, right, scientifically. And so I do think a legal system has to attend to all animals. And this is kind of the impetus of trying to get away from personhood, just because it's so mired in the human benchmark dynamic, right? Where we argue for a certain animal to be a person in test case litigation or in certain statutes that come forward. Canada actually has one being considered now. It's called the Jane Goodall Act. Right? So just from the name, we can understand what animals are centered. And I don't want for one moment to minimize the incredible pain, suffering, torture that non-human primates are going through, right? Or elephants or cetaceans. But if we want to get insects, farmed animals, other animals into our horizon, our legal landscape, I don't think personhood is going to get us there, because it's so trapped with that idea of, you know, the rational thinker. And these statutes that kind of reference why certain animals should be person invariably talk about their ability to think at a certain cognitive level. And while it's possible to emphasize that capacity and not be problematic, I think we still have to, you know, for emphasizing cognition not to be problematic in animals, I think we have to emphasize other capacities that animals have, and that really have a difference-oriented frame rather than one that's always measuring them according to pre-existing values that we value because we see ourselves that way.
Thank you, Manisha. This is really also something that I was wanting to talk to you about, maybe a bit more on a conceptual level, but I think is relevant to the discussion here, is that you put a lot of effort in your, at least in the draft chapter that I read of your introduction, into making a distinction between speciesism and anthropocentrism. And I think it's relevant to sort of look at that a bit further here, because at least from my own experiences in Northwestern Europe, when we think about animal politics or animal ethics, usually speciesism is the main issue, or is being considered as the main culprit of violence, systemic violence against animals. And I would even maybe go as far as to argue that certain animal political parties, such as, for example, the one in the Netherlands, but well, there's also a newly one here in Brussels, but we have to see how that one evolves, might be, I think, is maybe very much working against speciesism, but is heavily invested in anthropocentrism. So maybe that is that sameness logic that you were also just referring to. So I was wondering if you could just elaborate and take us as an audience a bit through your why you think it is important to make this distinction between speciesism and anthropocentrism, and also how you see anthropocentrism being part of European imperial colonialism, because you also write at some point that you see anthropocentrism as colonial violence.
All right. So thank you, Rizka. So the first question. So scholars who read about, you know, the importance of thinking about anthropocentrism versus speciesism, yes, do point to kind of the logic of sameness, that speciesism and arguments about it are kind of tethered to. So we, so kind of our classic text on speciesism, at least in the English-speaking world, is Peter Singer's Animal Liberation, right? And highly influential text, and much respect to that work and to Peter Singer for writing it. At the same time, right, when you see the structure of the argument, you see that it's like, let's look at thisism, let's look at thisism, and then we see speciesism. And then we can follow that, beautifully logical argument and understand, yes, to be a morally consistent person, I've got to combat this as well, as much as racism and sexism. But we don't get to see, like, are there any threads connecting this, or are actually all these, should they be clustered together and seen as a package of, force fields in our society? I think anthropocentrism, and other scholars would argue, lets us get to that kind of cluster image better than the separate image. Because when you say something is anthropocentric, it is, what does it mean to be anthropocentric? You're taking this certain idea, the anthropos, that Anna Gray and others' work has talked about as like the main criterion on which you are judging and who matters and why they matter. And then that already is a very intersectional concept, because of the idea of just the exclusions that valuing a certain type of rational actor immediately enacts, just on everyone, not just animals, who cannot live up to that image, right? And actually, I would argue that nobody lives up to that image, because consistently through their life, we all come into this life not being that rational actor, right, in our newborn state. And some of us, never reach that idea of cognition. And then maybe we do, but then as we end life, we are in a different cognitive state. Okay, so anthropocentrism lets us see kind of the harm of this type of thinking across different social problems. And so, and then that lets us, more easily illuminate how, the so-called animal problem, or like the race problem, or the gender, whatever compartmentalization, they're actually connected to devaluations across different groups. And so I think that goes into the second question, Mariska, about how is anthropocentrism part of colonialism? Well, let's take the Canadian example here. Right now, there is a resurgence thinking in academia, and I think seeping into mainstream legal institutions as well, of pre-existing Indigenous legal orders, right? So legal systems that existed but were recognized by European forces, either the British or the French. Okay, so what do these legal orders have to say about animals? Well, not that they're property. Yes, certainly, there are arguments about humans using animals, about humans, respectfully using animals that end in the death of animals' lives in hunting, fishing, trapping, what have you. So it's not to say it's a panacea for animals, but I think there's an argument to be made, and I have made that in a journal article, that it's a less anthropocentric worldview, that is ontology that is grounding this legal system. So colonialism, to kind of displace those pre-existing legal systems, and settler colonialism in Canada to kind of put the common law and the civil law in Quebec as, and have a bijural system in which we're just now trying to reimagine as multijural, or more legally pluralist than just bijural. Basically just regarded that as ridiculous, right? As just seeing animals as kin, as being a metric of human backwardness. And then, of course, animals were codified as property. And so we have a very interesting development, as I mentioned, the Jane Goodall Act, which can be critiqued for. It's one that tries to promote a person, an idea. But if you look at the preamble of this statute, first of all, it was brought in by a senator who is very much champion of decolonization in Canada, Senator Maurice Sinclair. And a year and a half ago, we had a successful whale bill be passed, but took a lot of ground support, even for whales. But now, although the existing cetaceans in captivity are still in captivity. No more breeding and no more bringing in whales in captivity, unless under very certain circumstances. They're ostensibly for their own good. Okay, now this new Jane Goodall Act tries to make an intervention in zoos, right? In captivity for primates, elephants, and possibly, it leaves the door open possibly for other animals. But what's really important is that in the legal text, so the preamble to the law, that's part of the law, the first kind of statement is that the indigenous idea of all my relations means we have to take interventions for animals, so that the pre-existing indigenous idea that animals are relations means their legal outcome should be different. And that's what colonialism, reversed them into property. So there's a very clear example, in addition to, of course, the devastation that animal groups, animal families experience, right? Part of the deterritorialization and the clearing of land happened to humans as well as to animals. And so we know all of those encroachments. But here's a very kind of core legal example that I just laid out.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah. I have a bunch of follow-up questions, but
Oh my
also
God.
give people at home.
This particular there's some resonance to what you're both discussing right now. So should I ask that
yeah,
question?
please jump in. Yeah.
So it's an anonymous question. They ask, you've already begun to address this by the questioning of legal personhood, but please expand. I find Black and POC post-humanist / animal studies engagement really pertinent, such as your own work or Sylvia Winter or Zakia Iman Jackson. But given the colonial legacies of dehumanization and the conceptualization of non-white bodies and white crippled bodies as less human, more animal, I'd be interested in hearing some of your reflections on how to move beyond this epistemological framework. I think this kind of
it definitely resonates
with
a
what
lot.
you were discussing now, right?
Yeah, I'm curious to see what Manisha.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So thank you so much for that question. Yeah. So it's a really important question. And of course, the authors that the questioner has listed have written on this, as well as even more recent texts by the co-sisters in the United States, and also Sonora Taylor, who is a self-identified person with disability, who has written about this very question about identifying with the animal, right? And so, obviously it's a complicated relationship, and how can we move past it? I really do think there, excuse me, there does have to be a recuperation of the animal. We do have to kind of get away from this idea that this word animal is a pejorative, or is something we have to not use in our discourse. And the idea that we are all kind of maybe going to a word like beings, it doesn't have to be even my legal sense of beings, but some other type of word that can take us out of the human animal divide, for those who maybe still don't want to recuperate the animal, could be another strategy, right? That of thinking of, that points us toward the shared histories, the shared biologies, the shared relationalities of what we think of as human and what we think of as animal. And going back, to understandings from my own readings, qualified as they are, of indigenous epistemologies, some indigenous epistemologies, is that some languages don't even have this idea that divides the human from the animal, right? So we have to understand that as our own, a part of this colonial legacy that not only has a separate word, but has created such sharp division. So I definitely think there are ways to think beyond these terms. I don't think we necessarily have to stop using the term human or animal. What is most important, and what I would argue, is to understand how deriding the animal and still abjuring it will still sustain the problematic relations that we want to get away from, whether it is racism or ableism, right, or sexism or other issues. So I think that is the core, for example, of Afko's argument in her Racism as Zoological Witchcraft, right? And that's also the core of the argument of Sonora Taylor in her text on disability and animal liberation. And I would agree with them.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, yeah, this is all very wonderful and very important. I see your hands.
No,
Like,
don't
is
look
there-
at my hands. Listen, you told me to let you know when you
Yeah.
get to 30 minutes.
Yeah.
You got to the 30 minutes, but we still, like me and
You did a lot of
we took a
speaking.
lot of your time as well. So how about we give you 10 more minutes
Yeah, but I like
of your
yeah,
questions
yeah,
as
yeah,
well?
yeah.
Yeah?
Okay, I like that.
You give us, you get, we give you, right? I think that the audience will agree with me that we haven't heard enough from Mariska.
Well, I think we can continue this sort of mixing. But thank you
Mixing
so
of
much
this?
for your generosity. No, but I would like I'm happy to know that we are at time wise as well. So
We're good.
yeah.
We're good.
So maybe to draw the conversation towards the legal aspect of your work and of the present text, and I also maybe would like to hear if there are any questions from the audience in that respect. So I'm in your final chapter, and I also think you just outlined it a bit towards the end of your presentation. You formulate 3 guiding principles that would sort of guide sort of a legal implementation of your proposal. And one of which would be the first is that you say the first guiding principle should be to fully prohibit any human and corporations trade in animals, right? And so this is where my own questions come in, indeed, sort of hearing, and maybe it's happening on the chat or Q&A chat, or maybe it's not happening at all, or maybe this is my experiences in different spaces with conversations with different people, is that then the question becomes of like, how do you weigh different vulnerabilities from different beings, may they be animals or humans, against each other? For example, indeed, we have, as you said, Sonora Taylor, who from a disability perspective, indeed talks about identifying with the animal and sort of working against seeing animalization as something that is necessarily negative. But then you also have the issue, for example, of disability people being in need of service animals or even medication, or not being able to adhere to a vegan lifestyle. So how do we, if we really think about this very concretely, what would your answer be to sort of, okay, then we have this guiding principle, but we still maybe have clashing interest in terms of vulnerabilities, in terms of embodiment. How do we then engage with that?
Yes, thank you, Mariska. So I think the first thing to notice with this question, important question, is that we already have these problems, even with animals as property, right? So when you look at legal contests, the ones that attract national headlines, they're usually competing rights. You think of religious rights pitted against equality rights as classic example, right? So it's not like, well, we don't have to think about what is more important in this issue, what is really at stake in a certain issue already among human groups. And that's kind of, what perhaps lawyers are paid for in terms of making those arguments. And these are the debates that go on. And we see, Canada is one of the jurisdictions as well that has legalized assisted dying, right? And we had, in terms of, there's no one monolithic disability perspective, right? But we know that there are other perspectives, and we know that people are going to have different views. And we had different interventions at the Supreme Court from different disability groups. One saying, how could you possibly legalize this? The other saying, it's my right to have this legalized and call my death when I want it with assistance. And so adding animals to the mix just, obviously kind of expands the types of things now we have to prohibit and deal with. But I think there has to be a baseline, as there is right now in our human kind of rights contestations, that we never say that certain beings are property. We never say that certain humans are property to answer this, to say, yes, it's okay because you need this to instrumentalize this group. there may be disagreements at the end as to what to do and really what is respectful and anti-oppressive, but there's a healthy dialogue about it. It's, for example, medical assistance in dying. So that's the second point I would make. We cannot let beings just be inferior to others just because we deem it so from an anthropocentric viewpoint. All right, so then we have to take a close analysis to some of the examples you gave, let's say like animals used in assistance for persons with disabilities or otherwise. And I think some people have written about this, although can't recall all the details of the arguments, but really thinking like, what may be helpful for these dogs, let's say, usually because they're service dogs, in this context, in terms of their well-being, to be partnered with this human person or not. Like, I think that has to be a close, localized analysis. But I would set a base point that we just can't assume just because it's that being is an animal that they should be used, right? And that then flips it to, why is it that we use animals in these contexts? Because society is not willing to pay for a humane job for someone to help a person with disability, right? So we have to reorder. If some of us in our society need extra support in school or walking on the street, right? We need to order society to give that support. We know that there are funds being spent on all different types of projects that we could funnel into this, right? And just to take the COVID example, in the pandemic, look at the cost. And so this is the argument, and let me bring up then the biggest use of animals, which is eating them, right? Farming, reproducing animals, bringing them deliberately into this world to eat them, and farming from the oceans. We know that whole-scale change is not easy, but it's possible. And we also know that agriculture and scientists, more and more scientists are attesting to this. And not that we should just value scientists, but that's what gives credibility to policymakers, showing how agriculture encroachments have related to zoonosis, to pandemics, to our COVID situation. And there are now economic tracking of the trillions of dollars, right, that this is costing, as opposed to if we had shifted previously. And then if we think of climate change, we need to move to a plant-based society, and we cannot do this type of animal agriculture. It does not make sense for the planet. So even though there will be human vulnerabilities, so right now the conversation in Canada on this is about the fish farming. So not about stopping agriculture at all. The meat and dairy lobbies are still very strong, but at least about the fish farming, because that is getting protest from Indigenous groups saying it's wrong, right? And it's polluting the oceans and the fish that are not farmed, and environmental groups. And so now there are economic aid packages that are being talked about how to transition out of an industry. And so Canada came forward with very generous comparatively aid packages in this past year for people who lost their jobs or had compromised work. And we can do that again when there's a political will, and then shift to a more viable society. So that would be my fulsome answer to that question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that there was, in the questions that I saw, a few of them that were concerned with the pragmaticness of it all. Like, is this realistic? Where, for example, there is a mention in one of the questions about a new definition in Belgian law, something called sensitive beings. Have you heard about that?
No, but I'm thinking this probably is more.
It's a translation.
To the sentience argument, of
Yeah.
difference logic, maybe.
But basically, there's a few people who are basically going like, but is this realistic? Can we realistically, or is it just more theory on beingness? Or, should we not move for more pragmatic approaches to protecting animals at the moment?
Okay, yes, thank you for that question. So this is a book that is coming from theoretical frameworks, but I do see that that's not mutually exclusive to having a practical outcome. It's trying to add to the dialogue as to what is wrong with property, for beings that we're supposed to value. We know that when we do national surveys, many people say they love animals, right? And many people think of their companion animals as their number one friend or family member, more so than their human family members and friends. Yet there's a disconnect because it's so normalized to eat animals, to eat their byproducts, and to just use them in everyday life in almost every product conceivable. So it's a huge change, no doubt. But the welfarist view, which is the view that there can be change for animals without taking them out of the property classification, that protection for animals won't ever really be protection, because they're still always going to be subordinate to the personhood interests of whoever owns them. So that's not protection. So if we're trying to get protection, we need a legal status that is going to put animals on par in terms of protective shield with those who want to use them. And that's what personhood does, right? In even traditional Kantian versions of personhood, no one gets to use me instrumentally because I'm a person. And so whether it's personhood or something like beingness, that beingness is meant to be as protective as personhood would be, even if it's different. And anything less won't be protective. So we can have bigger cages, right? We can have less time in transport, but those animals are still being transported. Those animals are still in captivity. That is not protective in my understanding of protection.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sensible beings, maybe sentient beings. I'm reading here. People are commenting on that. I don't know if
Yeah,
this is
go ahead.
this is a development in Belgian legal vocabulary. I don't know much about it, but I want to move perhaps to some other questions that I'm seeing. Another category of questions on whether or not this idea of being, well, look, it says personhood has been applied. This is Christine Winter saying personhood has been applied to whole georegions to give the region and all beings and non-beings subjectivity that are living on it. Do you think your concept of beingness could be extended to georegions / ecosystems? Now we're going...
Yeah. No, I like that. Can I maybe build on that question?
Yeah,
Because this was something that also that came to my mind in your, when hearing your answer just now, is that indeed you must be aware of the whole activist, professional, as well as scholarly development of thinking about the rights of nature. And also the strategies by many indigenous peoples that maybe is being called here, like the georegions, to, for example, in Ecuador or in New Zealand, to give rights to certain natural, oftentimes water entities, so to speak. Not sure if entities here is the direct translation in English, but yeah, let's
I always
stay
say
with that.
formations.
Formations, maybe. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So mountains, rivers, etc. So that is still, in that sense, very much steeped in a rights framework. And maybe, if I follow your argument correctly, Manisha, it would also be sort of steeped in a sort of anthropocentric and does liberal humanist type of framework. So I was indeed wondering, building on that question of Christine, to hear your thoughts about that sort of not non-human, non-animal sort of formations and their struggle for legal recognition, legal representation, protection.
Yes, if the question is, can beingness be extended to other entities like a georegion? Yes, it could, but I must emphasize that beingness is meant to be a status equivalent to personhood, to the extent that we imagine personhood as a status that prevents instrumentalization without consent of that person, right? So if I don't want to work for you, no one is going to make me do it, right? I have to take the consequences maybe of not having a job, but you can't just make me work for you. Okay, so beingness is meant to be as protective. So it cannot easily apply to even other non-human entities that we're going to instrumentalize. So in the book, I say actually beingness cannot be applied to plants because I can't see how it's possible for humans and animals to go forward without eating plants, right? So to call that plant a being would be to dilute it to respectful killing. And that is not what beingness is supposed to be. It has to be something more protective. And so right now, when we think of the actual legal developments that are happening for rivers or for other regions, it's still, if you trace kind of what's said in Parliament, what's said in the legislative debates about them, or even how they're then, post implementation put into effect or interpreted by courts, it's still very much an anthropocentric understanding, because it's tethered to a human group, whether it's an indigenous group or the large idea of the nation or the collective, which is imagined as a human collective or nation. And that is a problem. And we're never going to get away from so many issues that are causing planetary harm, whether it's climate change or whether it's zoonotic disease, until we consider other beings that are not human in our fold in terms of our decision making. And it's until we stop subordinating them to human interests. And so beingness really is trying to hold on to the integrity of not doing that. So that's just how I would qualify for other types of non-humans.
Yeah, interesting. So if I understand it correctly, may I?
Yeah.
So if I understand it correctly, you're saying the category beingness that you're introducing wouldn't necessarily be applicable to georegions, things like lakes or mountains or some sort, but the core of your argument is that there is no need to rank any type of existence, whether it is a legal being, a person, a property, or a georegion. So there would be no need necessarily to sort of make it fit into that category of beingness, because there's no need for rankings. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes. So yes, there's no need for ranking, and not applying beingness to something like a georegion just because, let's say humans and animals would still use that georegion and use it as a resource. That's why I wouldn't apply beingness to it, because it's not being fully protected from being instrumentalized. Doesn't mean there can't be some other type of status that tries to preserve it or to, regulate how humans and animals are using, let's say, a lake, right, or a river. So it doesn't mean there has to be nothing, but I wouldn't apply beingness to it. And so my chapter 5 in the book talks about this in some detail, because beingness is meant to be as protective as personhood. And so a lot of the scholarly critique about these grand statements in constitutions or in other legal documents about personhood for nature, when it all comes down to reality, it doesn't do anything, because it's still being instrumentalized for human reasons.
Let's all read chapter 5 of your book.
Yeah. But so I think this is part of that same. So Anu Pandey is asking, how does agency figure in your proposal of beingness for non-human animals as opposed to personhood? Is it pertinent at all in deciding who is being? Is that what you mean when you respond with the geoformations, the grass, the plant can't ask not to be instrumentalized? Is that the agency? Is that, or
no, I wasn't speaking of agency there. Whether or not someone is an agent in the classic, liberal sense, we understand that is not a criterion of eligibility for beingness. No, the agency I made reference to earlier in terms of the preliminary steps is that some people might say, well, this seems completely like unimplementable and not feasible to implementation, because we don't know what animals want. They can't tell us anything. And that's where I said we can still see animals as agents and still understand communication. We just have to, think kind of beyond the boxes that we normally think. That's where I was talking about agency, but agency is not a criterion for beingness.
Okay. Another question that is asked is where the cognition is, and how cognition fits into the category of beingness.
Yes, cognition is not a criterion. So there is no criterion for beingness other than being a biological animal. So
Nice.
the point in chapter 5 is to say, do capacities then not matter? To Mariska's earliest question about how to decide when things compete. And that's where I say capacities do matter, right? So if you have a classic conflict, let's say, between cats and birds, right, in a specific community, are we not going to look at capacities? No, we can look at capacities, but it depends how we do that. If you have, I mean, we do that right now, right? I mean, look at who's getting the COVID vaccine, right? We have to look at the human group and say, going into question, who's most vulnerable, right? And but a solution is never to say in that, well, this group can be culled, which is what we say for animals now, right? Whether it's dealing with quote unquote invasive species or what have you. So that's what has to shift, thinking of animals as protected, and then thinking of how to deal with ubiquitous and countless social problems that will be there. But that to imagine that we have a neat, orderly world now without there aren't any conflicts or contests among humans, I mean, that's also a too simplistic a view. So yes, animals do open up a big Pandora's box, but it's not like the current legal system is devoid of difficult decision making.
Yeah. I also think that this question maybe relates to what at least in my head, we've discussed earlier about the difference between speciesism and anthropocentrism, because indeed, I think sort of the capacities sort of understanding would sort of align with this sort of category that we already value, the idea of human or person in a legal sense, that sort of first like centuries ago was maybe when it mainly was sort of the Christian theology reigning, it would be having a soul or not, and then it would be having reason and rational capacities, etc. And so I guess you also in your book, but also I think in the broader literature, takes sort of finds that problematic because it's sort of constantly shifting the boundary of who or what counts as a life, as a person, as a man, as a grievable life. Maybe in Judith Butler's words, that was put it so beautifully on one of the sheets. And the way I understand Manisha's argument is that indeed beingness sort of moves away from that entire discussion at all, because it already finds this sort of continuing defining of person and personhood problematic, building on feminist and post-colonial feminist work. Am I answering your work correctly?
Yes.
Okay.
To be fair, I think that I misrepresented Jesse Eggers' question about cognition.
Yeah.
I think Jesse Eggers right now is sitting behind the screen and said, that's not what I asked. What they asked was about the criterion of cognition. They ask, maybe we can also think of cognition from a different perspective than just that of the human, as to include other forms of cognition. And I wouldn't know what those would be.
No.
I don't know, but I don't know if this is something that you would be interested, because there are a number of questions here that I don't understand. Okay. There are some tough philosophical questions here. I don't know whether you want to hear some of these very tough philosophical questions. Are you up for it, Manisha?
Yes, or that you can email them to me as well. I'm not sure how the audience what they would prefer.
Okay, well, how about this one? So there's this one about, so are there other forms of cognition we can think of that could replace our humanist, our anthropocentric idea of cognition? But there's also this question whether you could briefly trace the genealogy of the notion of beingness that you are developing. Is it beingness a la Heidegger, or being more in the sense of Winter or Nelson Maldonado Torres? I don't know what this question means.
It's independent of all. Apologies to everyone.
Okay, good.
Yes, it's
briefly
taking the idea of beings.
That's a brief genealogy indeed. So there is apparently in the French National Assembly, not the Belgian National Assembly, there is a new text adopted that defines animals as sentient living beings, être vivant doué de sensibilité. So people are all kind of, there are conversations happening in the Q&A. So people are kind of, helping each other get to this, where we started with sensible being, then sentient beings, and now sentient living beings. So living beings that are endowed with sensibility. Yeah.
Is there a question about this?
No, there's no question, but I just wanted to clarify. I just want to
okay.
update us all what's happening in the Q&A.
Thank you. No, because I think, I'm curious to hear your view, Manisha, but I think that's the whole argument about valuing animals to the extent that they have the capability of feeling and of suffering, and therefore attending care towards them, is a strong argument in animal advocacy, in animal scholarship, but it also tends to that sort of continuing hierarchization that I think beingness wants to sort of move away from, and it sort of works more in the category towards personhood rather than beingness. But what would how would you sort of situate sort of a legal intervention on animals as sentient living beings instead of property?
So again, chapter 5 discusses this. It's more of a biocentric model about just what is living, and then there's a subsection called "Is Sentience the New Reason?" where I try not to emphasize sentience, but then I do say being sentient does matter in these policy moments about how to move forward in a particular problem. So let's say, right, deer eating too many plants, for example. But then I also try to be careful about the literature on plants and not minimize that emerging literature that says, plants can do a lot more than we think they can, right? Or that some of us think we can. Some of us already know this, given the traditions we have grown up in, but most of us think plants can't think, can't feel, don't have intentions. So yes, I think the core comes back to like not trying to rank one life form over another, trying to be attentive to what all living beings require, but then knowing there are some difficult decisions, but that's why beingness doesn't apply to plants, because plants invariably are going to die, and I don't want beingness to be diluted to be a legal classification that permits that.
Nice. I think we're gonna end there. We have about 2 or 3 minutes.
Oh, really? Okay.
Do you have any burning question, perhaps?
For the last? No.
For you think, I mean, I won't be able to sleep if I don't ask this question tonight.
No, if we have time for such a burning question, I would rather give it to the audience.
To the audience? Well, there's a lot of questions. No, I don't. I think we've covered some of most of them, and I've grouped them a little bit in terms of topics. But I see many thank yous. The thank yous are very numerous in the Q&A. So maybe that's perhaps a good way to end in terms of the Q&A. And maybe indeed we could send you some of these questions in the future. So you're very much the audience is very grateful for what my job now is to kind of give us an outro to allow us all to kind of go from this very intense discussion and learning and questions also. I have so many questions now, to rounding up and perhaps coming together and moving on to more. And there is more. I started the evening telling you all that when Goedele invited me to co-curate the second installment, her and I found ourselves in a sort of echo chamber of ambition. So I was ambitious, she was ambitious. So we ended up going back and forth and getting bigger ideas. And before long, we realized that we could not possibly physically do all the things that we wanted to do in just one evening, in just one event. Our partner Kai Theater indulged us when we said that we asked for more space and more resources. So yes, this was only the first installment of the second installment of the More Than Human Encounters series. We've got 2 more save the dates for you, okay? On the 20th of January, that's the first, I will be moderating a roundtable discussion with researcher Eva Bernay Kempers and sociologist Darko Lagunas, and a special guest, the Dunes of Schouwen-Duiveland. At the core of that discussion lies the entangled and entangling question of of how to represent non-human actors, or how to translate their voices. The next date to save in your agenda is the afternoon of the 21st of January. We have invited the very passionate and visionary Klaas Kluitenbrouwer from at the Nieuwe Institute in Rotterdam. And there with him and his group and his team, we will read and treat the campus of Etterbeek at the VUB as a zoop, meaning how do different life worlds relate to each other at the campus Etterbeek of the VUB? Which internal and external relationships are critical for the development of the quality of life there, not just one type of life, right? Of all these many different types of life. So a lot of these questions will be answered in practical and also theoretical ways in the events to come. Tickets for both the roundtable and the ZOAP workshop are already, you can be reserved already online. Nothing is for free in this world. However, we do offer free reservations to those who need it. No questions asked. Those of you with a little more to give are, of course, invited to contribute financially. Your contribution do allow us to pay everyone involved, from the technical staff to the speakers and even the hostesses. So contribute generously if you can. So once again, on behalf of Goedele Nutens, Marleen Wijnands, and the Kai Theater team, I want to thank Professor Manisha. I want to thank Mariska Jong for your insights and for the many lessons and questions you brought to us. I also want to thank the entire Kai Theater technical team that you do not see, but that have been working very, very hard to make this all go seamlessly. And of course, the programming team that always finds an extra spot for us to do what we want to do. And last but not least, I want to thank Goedele Nutens for the invitation to work with you. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I want to thank you for the many, many ways in which you trusted me. Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much, Manisha Dek, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, Olave,
Okay.
for your wonderful work tonight.
And now I'm shy.